The warm glow of twinkling fairy lights wrapped the grand oak beams of the winter hearth, an exclusive restaurant nestled in the heart of Vermont's snowy mountains. It was Christmas Eve, and the ambience inside the restaurant was as luxurious as it was serene. Fine crystal glasses sparkled under soft chandelier lighting, and a gentle hum of conversation floated over the rich scent of roasted chestnuts and truffle-infused delicacies. The evening was in full swing, the room alive with laughter and clinking glasses, when a subtle ripple of whispers disrupted the festive mood. "Barron Trump is here," gasped a waiter, his voice a hushed mixture of shock and apprehension. He hurried back to the kitchen, his pale face betraying his unease. The young man's name had barely been uttered when the imposing figure of Barron Trump entered, flanked by a team of suited security guards. He cut a striking silhouette, tall and poised, his dark coat dusted with falling snow. There was an aura of calm command about him, despite his youth, and his mere presence shifted the room's dynamic. Conversations dropped to murmurs, and heads turned as guests watched him walk toward a reserved table near the large bay window. In the back of the restaurant, head chef Elliot Grayson stood at his station, meticulously plating a dish of seared duck breast. His normally steady hand stilled for a moment as the name reached his ears. His sharp blue eyes darkened, and he muttered under his breath, "Not tonight." Chef asked Sophie, the pastry chef, glancing up from her station. She had never seen Elliot falter, not once in her years of working under him. "I'm not serving him," Elliot said, his tone firm and low, but the words carried the weight of finality. Sophie blinked, confused. "Not serving him? Chef, it's Christmas Eve." "I don't care," Elliot interrupted, setting down his tongs with deliberate precision. His voice remained calm, but his expression was taut with something unspoken. "It's my decision at that moment." Mark, the sous chef, entered, his face flushed from the heat of the stove and the rush of service. "What's going on?" he asked, noticing the sudden tension in the room. "Elliot's refusing to serve Barron Trump," Sophie explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark's eyes widened. "What? You can't be serious. Do you know what this could mean for us?" Elliot turned to face his team, his jaw clenched. "I know exactly what it means, Mark. And my answer is still no." Meanwhile, in the dining room, Barron had settled into his seat, his expression calm as he surveyed the room. Outside the window, the snow fell in soft, steady flakes, painting the world in a peaceful white. Yet inside, the tension was palpable. The murmurs of the other diners grew louder, curiosity and confusion evident in their glances toward Barron's table. Thomas, the maitre d', approached cautiously, his professional smile faltering. "Mr. Trump, welcome to the winter hearth. May I take your order?" Barron offered a polite nod. "Thank you. I'd like to start with the seasonal soup, followed by the filet mignon, medium rare." Thomas scribbled down the order, his hands trembling slightly. "Of course, sir," he replied before retreating to the kitchen. "Chef, we have his order," Thomas announced as he entered the kitchen. "We need to." "No," Elliot interrupted, his voice cold and resolute. "We're not serving him." Thomas froze, disbelief etched across his face. "You're refusing?" "Elliot, he's not just any guest. Do you understand who he is?" "I do," Elliot replied, his voice laced with quiet intensity. He wiped his hands on a towel and leaned against the counter, his gaze distant. "And I also understand what it means to follow my conscience." Mark stepped forward, his frustration boiling over. "Your conscience? Elliot, this isn't just about you. We've got a full dining room of people watching this unfold. This could ruin us." Elliot's shoulders tensed, and he turned sharply to face Mark. "Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I haven't thought about the consequences?" "Then why?" Sophie asked softly, her voice trembling with the weight of the moment. "Why would you do this for a moment?" Elliot didn't respond. The bustling kitchen seemed to pause as all eyes turned to him. Finally he spoke, his voice low and heavy with emotion. 3 years ago he began. On another snowy night like this one, my son, Daniel, joined a protest outside the Capitol. He was a kind boy, too kind for this world, maybe. He got caught in the chaos and the violence. Wrong place, wrong time. The room fell silent. Elliot swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. I lost him that night. And while I know Barron Trump wasn't there, every time I hear that name, I can't help but think of the pain his family represents for me. It's a wound I've carried ever since. At his table, Barron glanced at his phone, aware of the growing unease around him. One of his guards leaned in and whispered, "There seems to be an issue with the service." Barron raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but curious. "What kind of issue?" The guard hesitated. "It appears the chef has refused to serve you." Barron's brow furrowed slightly, though his composure remained unshaken. Refused? He looked around the room, noting the guests' furtive glances and hushed whispers. Interesting. As the minutes dragged on, Barron decided to take matters into his own hands. Rising from his seat, he adjusted his coat and walked purposefully toward the kitchen. Elliot looked up as Barron entered, his tall frame casting a shadow across the room. For a moment, neither man spoke. The hum of the kitchen appliances was the only sound. "Chef Grayson," Barron said, his tone polite but firm. "I understand you've refused to serve me. May I ask why?" Elliot hesitated, his heart pounding. The room seemed to shrink around him as he met Barron's gaze. "It's not personal," he said finally. "You've done nothing wrong. But I can't. I won't." Barron tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I see. If I've offended you in some way, I'd like to know." Elliot's fists clenched at his sides, his voice breaking as he replied, "It's not about you, Barron. It's about what your family represents for me, a loss I can't forgive, a pain I can't forget for the first time." A flicker of understanding crossed Barron's face. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said softly. "Truly I am. But holding on to that pain forever, it won't bring your son back." Elliot's breath caught. Something in Barron's words pierced through the wall of grief and anger he had built around himself. He stared at the young man, seeing not a symbol of his pain, but a person, a boy barely older than his own son had been. The room seemed to hold its breath as the two men stood facing each other. In Barron's calm blue eyes, Elliot saw no malice, no arrogance, only sincerity. It was a stark contrast to the storm raging within himself. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Barron said quietly. "But maybe, tonight of all nights, we could both find a little peace." Elliot closed his eyes, his hands trembling as he leaned against the counter. The weight of his grief threatened to crush him, but Barron's words lingered, offering a glimmer of hope. Elliot began, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can." Barron offered a small, understanding smile. "Take your time, chef. Healing isn't a race." The kitchen seemed frozen in time as Elliot Grayson leaned heavily against the counter, his breath uneven. Barron Trump stood a few feet away, his composed demeanor unshaken, though a flicker of empathy softened his features. Around them, the kitchen staff watched in silent tension, their gazes darting between the two figures at the heart of an unexpected storm. Elliot finally broke the silence, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't understand, Barron. You can't understand." Barron's brow furrowed, his tone gentle yet unwavering. "Then help me, chef. Explain it to me." Elliot's hand trembled as he reached for a dish towel, his fingers twisting it absently as though searching for something tangible to ground him. He avoided Barron's eyes, staring instead at the polished steel countertop. "My son Daniel," he began, his words faltering as the weight of the memory pressed down on him. "He was my world, the best thing I ever created." Barron remained silent, his posture open, his presence unintrusive. He had learned early in life that sometimes silence spoke louder than words, and now was one of those moments. Elliot's voice grew steadier, though it was thick with grief. Daniel was only 17, full of dreams, plans, energy. He loved Christmas, always the first to string up lights, the first to laugh at my ridiculous holiday playlists. A faint, wistful smile flickered across Elliot's face before disappearing, replaced by a shadow of anguish. 3 years ago, he joined a protest. He believed in justice, in fairness. But that night, chaos erupted. He was caught in the middle, and I wasn't there to protect him. The room was deathly quiet. Even the gentle hum of the kitchen's appliances seemed subdued, as though they too were mourning the loss Elliot laid bare. Barron took a slow step forward, his voice measured and sincere. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Chef, but what does that have to do with me?" Elliot's head snapped up, and for the first time his eyes locked onto Barron's. Pain and anger swirled within them. "Your family's name, your legacy, it's a reminder of everything I lost. Every time I see it, hear it, it's like losing Daniel all over again." Barron inhaled deeply, his expression contemplative. He nodded slightly, as though acknowledging the magnitude of Elliot's pain. "I can't undo the past," he said softly. "But I can stand here now and tell you that I'm not my family. I'm just me, trying to enjoy a meal on Christmas Eve." Elliot's grip on the dish towel tightened, the fabric twisting between his fingers. "It's not fair," he whispered, more to himself than to Barron. "None of it is fair." "No, it isn't," Barron replied, his voice steady yet laced with empathy. "But punishing me won't bring Daniel back." The truth in Barron's words was a knife that cut through Elliot's defenses, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. He felt the sharp sting of tears welling in his eyes, but blinked them away, unwilling to break down in front of his staff or Barron. "You don't know what it's like," Elliot said, his tone almost accusatory, "to lose a child. To live every day with the weight of that absence." "No, I don't," Barron admitted, his honesty disarming. "But I do know what it's like to carry a name that precedes me, to be judged before I've even spoken. And I know what it's like to feel alone in a room full of people." Elliot studied the young man before him, seeing something he hadn't expected, a quiet strength tempered by vulnerability. For the first time he saw Barron not as a symbol, but as a person. Before Elliot could respond, Sophie, the pastry chef, stepped forward cautiously. Her voice was soft, hesitant, as though she were treading on sacred ground. "Chef," she said, her gaze flicking between Elliot and Barron. Maybe tonight doesn't have to be about pain. Maybe it can be about something more." Elliot turned to her, his expression conflicted. "What do you mean?" Sophie gestured subtly toward the dining room, where the warm glow of the Christmas lights spilled into the kitchen. "It's Christmas Eve, a night for forgiveness, for hope. Isn't that what Daniel would have wanted?" Elliot's breath hitched at the mention of his son. He looked down, his reflection staring back at him from the polished countertop. Sophie's words lingered in the air, weaving their way through the tangled web of his emotions. Barron spoke again, his tone gentle yet firm. "She's right, Chef. Tonight can be different. It can be a step toward healing, not just for you, but for everyone in this room." The room felt charged with possibility, the kind that only comes when people choose vulnerability over pride, connection over division. Elliot closed his eyes, the weight of his grief pressing heavily on his chest. Slowly he exhaled, the breath carrying with it a sliver of the pain he had clung to for so long. When he opened his eyes, they were filled not with anger, but with something softer, perhaps even a glimmer of hope. He turned to Barron, his voice steady but quiet. "I don't know if I can ever truly let go of what I've lost, but maybe I can start tonight." Barron offered a small, understanding smile. "That's all anyone can ask for." Elliot nodded, a decision solidifying in his mind. He turned to his staff, who watched him with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. "Prepare Mr. Trump's order," he said, his voice firm but no longer cold. "And make sure it's perfect." A ripple of surprise and relief passed through the kitchen. Sophie smiled softly, Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and Thomas hurried to relay the message to the dining room. As the kitchen sprang into action, Elliot approached Barron, who had stepped aside to give the staff room to work. "Thank you," Elliot said, the words carrying the weight of sincerity. "For your patience, for your patience, for your understanding." Barron inclined his head, his expression calm yet warm. "Thank you, Chef, for taking that first step." The tension that had hung over the room like a storm cloud began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of quiet resolution. Elliot returned to his station, his movements purposeful as he oversaw the preparation of Barron's meal. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost forever: peace. Out in the dining room, Barron returned to his table. The whispers and furtive glances of the other guests had shifted in tone, curiosity giving way to quiet admiration. As he sat down, his guard leaned in and murmured, "Is everything all right, sir?" Barron nodded, his gaze thoughtful as he looked toward the kitchen. "It will be." The snow outside continued to fall, blanketing the world in a hushed stillness. Inside the winter hearth, the air was no longer heavy with tension but alive with the spirit of Christmas. It was a night of forgiveness, of connection, and of hope, a night that, for Elliot and Barron, marked the beginning of something new. The dining room of the winter hearth, bathed in the golden light of the season, hummed with a renewed energy. Conversations picked up once more, albeit in hushed tones, as the tension that had gripped the room began to fade. Guests occasionally glanced toward Barron Trump, seated calmly at his table, and the entrance to the kitchen, where the drama of the evening had unfolded. Behind the swinging doors of the kitchen, Elliot Grayson stood with his arms crossed, watching his team work with precision and care. He still felt the weight of his earlier outburst, but the act of preparing Barron's meal carried a sense of purpose that steadied him. The scent of rosemary and garlic filled the air as the sous chef basted the filet mignon, its caramelized crust glistening under the warm kitchen lights. Sophie approached Elliot hesitantly, her hands dusted with flour from the freshly baked rolls she had just prepared. "Chef," she began softly, "I just wanted to say, I think you made the right choice." Elliot looked at her, his expression tired but contemplative. "Do you?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, her gaze earnest. "What you did earlier, it wasn't just about him. It was about you too. Letting go, even just a little, can make all the difference." Elliot exhaled a long, heavy breath that seemed to release something deep within him. Maybe he said quietly, "But I'm not sure I deserve that kind of grace." "None of us do," Sophie replied with a small smile. "That's why it's so powerful." Her words lingered in Elliot's mind as he turned his attention back to the meal. He watched as Mark plated the dish with meticulous care, the fillet resting atop a bed of creamy mashed potatoes, flanked by sautéed green beans and a drizzle of red wine reduction. It was a simple yet elegant plate, one that Elliot would have been proud to serve under any other circumstances. When the dish was ready, Thomas appeared at the pass, his expression a mixture of relief and determination. "I'll deliver it myself," he said, his voice steady. Elliot nodded, stepping aside to let Thomas take the plate. He watched as the maitre d' carried it out to the dining room, the swinging doors briefly revealing a glimpse of the festive atmosphere beyond. Elliot couldn't help but feel a pang of anxiety, wondering how Barron would receive the meal and what it might mean for the fragile truce they had established. At his table, Barron sat with his hands folded, his posture relaxed but his expression thoughtful. He had spent much of his young life under scrutiny, but tonight's events had felt different, more personal. He glanced up as Thomas approached, the plate balanced carefully in his hands. "Mr. Trump," Thomas said, placing the dish in front of him with a practiced flourish. "Your filet mignon. On behalf of the winter hearth, we hope you enjoy your meal." Barron looked up at the maitre d', offering a polite nod. "Thank you, Thomas. And please, thank Chef Grayson and the team for me." Thomas hesitated for a moment, clearly caught off guard by Barron's gracious demeanor. "Of course, sir," he replied, retreating toward the kitchen with a newfound respect for the young man. As Barron picked up his fork and knife, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. A few guests watched him out of the corners of their eyes, curious to see how he would react, but Barron paid them no mind, his focus on the meal before him. He cut into the fillet, the knife gliding effortlessly through the perfectly cooked meat, and took a bite. The flavors were rich and harmonious, a testament to the skill and care that had gone into its preparation. He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth curving upward in quiet appreciation. For the first time that evening, he allowed himself to relax, savoring the moment. It wasn't just the meal that brought him comfort, but the knowledge that something meaningful had been set in motion, something that extended far beyond the confines of the restaurant. In the kitchen, the atmosphere was tense but hopeful. Elliot stood by the pass, his arms crossed as he waited for any sign of how the meal had been received. When Thomas returned, his expression unreadable, Elliot felt his stomach knot. "Well," he asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Thomas smiled, a small but genuine expression that immediately eased the tension in the room. "He's enjoying it," he said simply, "and he asked me to thank you." Elliot let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly, though the weight of the evening still lingered. "Good," he said quietly. "That's good." But even as the kitchen returned to its rhythm, Elliot found himself retreating to a quieter corner, his thoughts a jumble of conflicting emotions. He leaned against the stainless steel counter, his hands gripping the edge as he stared down at the floor. The memory of Daniel's laughter, his bright eyes and boundless energy, played in his mind like a film reel he couldn't stop. "I'm sorry, Daniel," he murmured under his breath, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but I hope you'd understand." As the evening wore on, the dining room gradually emptied, the guests departing with contented smiles and holiday wishes. Barron remained at his table, sipping from a glass of sparkling water as he gazed out the window. The snow had stopped, leaving a pristine blanket of white across the landscape, and the soft glow of the Christmas lights reflected off the frosted panes. Thomas approached cautiously, clearing his throat to announce his presence. "Mr. Trump, is there anything else I can get for you?" Barron shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "No, thank you, Thomas. I'm all set." He paused, then added, "But if Chef Grayson has a moment, I'd like to speak with him." Thomas hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the kitchen. "I'll let him know," he said, his tone careful. When he relayed the request to Elliot, the chef's initial reaction was one of reluctance. "What more could he possibly want?" Elliot muttered, his tone laced with fatigue. "He seems sincere," Thomas replied. "I think he just wants to talk." Elliot sighed, running a hand through his hair. The idea of facing Barron again filled him with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. But something in Thomas's expression, perhaps the quiet respect he had shown earlier, pushed Elliot to nod in agreement. "All right," he said. "I'll go." Elliot stepped into the dining room, his presence commanding but subdued. Barron stood as the chef approached, extending a hand in a gesture of respect. "Chef Grayson," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Thank you for coming." Elliot hesitated briefly before shaking Barron's hand. "Mr. Trump," he replied, his tone measured. They sat across from each other at the table, the air between them charged with unspoken words. Barron was the first to break the silence. "I wanted to thank you," he began, his gaze sincere. "Not just for the meal, but for everything tonight. It couldn't have been easy for you." Elliot's lips pressed into a thin line. "It wasn't," he admitted. "But I owed it to myself and to you to try." Barron nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I can't pretend to understand your pain, Chef. But I do know that carrying it alone, it can consume you." Elliot looked away, his jaw tightening. "It already has," he said quietly. "For years, I've let it define me. And tonight, I realize just how much I've let it control my life." Barron leaned forward slightly, his tone earnest. "Then maybe tonight can be the start of something new. A step toward healing." Elliot met Barron's gaze, the young man's words resonating deeply. He saw in Barron not just a symbol of the past, but a glimmer of hope for the future. And in that moment, something shifted within him, a small but significant change that felt like the first breath of fresh air after a long storm. "I hope you're right," Elliot said, his voice soft but resolute. "I hope you're right." As the two men shook hands once more, the dining room of the winter hearth felt transformed, not by its decorations or its cuisine, but by the simple act of connection. And as the clock struck midnight, Marking the arrival of Christmas Day, the spirit of forgiveness and renewal lingered in the air, promising brighter days ahead. The winter hearth lay still in the quiet aftermath of Christmas Eve's dinner service. Snow gently blanketed the Vermont mountains, muffling the world in a serene silence that stood in stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions that had passed through the restaurant hours before. The last of the guests had departed, leaving the dining room dimly lit by the soft glow of its Christmas decorations. Inside the kitchen, the staff was busy with the final tasks of the evening, their movements methodical but tinged with the quiet relief of a service completed. Chef Elliot Grayson stood alone near the back exit, leaning against the cold steel of a prep counter. His hands, calloused from years of work, clutched a steaming mug of black coffee. The night had left him emotionally drained, his thoughts swirling like the snow outside. Despite the exhaustion, there was a lightness in his chest he hadn't felt in years, a strange, unfamiliar sensation that might have been hope. Chef Sophie's voice broke the silence, pulling Elliot from his thoughts. She approached cautiously, holding a small plate covered in foil. "I saved you a piece of the chocolate torte. Thought you could use something sweet after tonight." Elliot glanced at her, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Thanks, Sophie. You didn't have to." She shrugged, her expression kind. "I wanted to. It's Christmas, after all." Elliot nodded, taking the plate from her and setting it on the counter. For a moment neither of them spoke, the air between them charged with the unspoken weight of the evening. "You handled it well," Sophie said finally, her tone gentle. "Better than I expected." Elliot huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "I don't know about that." "No, really," Sophie insisted, her eyes earnest. "You didn't just cook for him, you faced something you've been running from. That takes courage." Elliot looked down at his coffee, the steam curling upward like a question mark. Maybe he murmured, "But it doesn't feel like enough." Sophie stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "It's a start, Chef, and sometimes that's all we need." Elliot let her words settle over him like a warm blanket. He nodded slowly, offering her a quiet thank you before she returned to the kitchen. He stood there for a while longer, sipping his coffee and staring out the frosted window. The memory of Barron's calm, steady gaze lingered in his mind, a reminder of the unexpected connection they had shared. Meanwhile, Barron Trump sat in the back seat of a sleek black SUV, its engine humming quietly as it navigated the snow-covered roads leading to his hotel. The interior was warm, but Barron barely noticed, his thoughts consumed by the events of the night. He leaned his head against the cold window, watching the snowflakes swirl in the glow of the passing streetlights. James, his lead security guard, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Quiet night, sir?" he asked, his tone light but respectful. Barron turned his gaze toward James, his expression thoughtful. "Not exactly," he replied. "It was different." James raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. He had worked for the Trump family long enough to recognize when Barron needed space to process his thoughts. The young man was different from the rest of his family, quieter, more introspective. It was one of the reasons James had always respected him. After a long silence, Barron spoke again. "Have you ever met someone who reminded you of a part of yourself you didn't even know was there?" James considered the question as he navigated a turn. "Can't say I have, sir, but it sounds like quite an experience." Barron nodded, his gaze drifting back to the window. It was. Back at the winter hearth, Elliot was wrapping up his night when Thomas approached him, holding an envelope in his hand. "Chef," he said, his tone hesitant. "This was left at the front desk. It's addressed to you." Elliot frowned, taking the envelope. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and unfamiliar. He opened it carefully, unfolding the single sheet of stationery inside. As his eyes scanned the page, his breath caught. "Dear Chef Grayson, thank you for tonight. I know it wasn't easy, but it meant more than you realize. Your courage to face your pain and take that first step is inspiring. I hope, in time, you'll find the peace you deserve." Wishing you a Merry Christmas. Barron Trump. Elliot read the note twice, his hands trembling slightly. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that pressed against his chest. He folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope, holding it tightly as though it were a lifeline. For the first time in years, he felt a crack in the armor of his grief, a small opening through which the light of something new could shine. For years, Chef Elliot Grayson had carried a burden so heavy it shaped every aspect of his life, a grief that hardened him, isolated him, and turned his passion for cooking into a mechanical routine. The memory of his son Daniel, tragically lost in a moment of chaos, haunted him. Each day, Elliot buried himself in the kitchen, believing that pain was his penance. His interactions with others were guarded, his emotions locked away behind an impenetrable wall. But Christmas Eve brought an unexpected confrontation, not with another person, but with his own heart. When Barron Trump entered the winter hearth, Elliot's refusal to serve him wasn't just an act of defiance, it was a manifestation of the unresolved anger and sadness that consumed him. Yet, in Barron's calm demeanor and sincere attempts to connect, Elliot saw something he hadn't felt in years: understanding. The note Barron left for Elliot, simple yet profound, touched a part of him that he thought was beyond reach. For the first time in years, Elliot felt the faintest flicker of hope, a possibility that he might someday step out of the shadow of his loss and rediscover the joy he once knew. Yet questions linger. Can Elliot truly let go of his grief? Will his newfound connection with Barron become a catalyst for change, or will it simply be a fleeting moment of comfort? What happens next in this journey of healing and redemption? Will Elliot embrace the chance to rebuild his life, or will his past continue to hold him captive? Comment 2 if you're eager to see how this story unfolds. Let us know your thoughts. What do you think lies ahead for Chef Elliot and Barron? Share your predictions below.